industry. Through my career, I've spent time working in the UK-based oil and gas pipeline companies, various consultancies involved with response and remediation strategy development, and also have quite a few years under my belt working and living in the Middle East with the oil and gas industry. Today, I'm going to present a short slide deck, which will hopefully give some insight into inland tier preparedness and response with relation to good practice. It's quite a large topic, so I've tried to keep it as condensed as possible. Sorry, presentation just won't click over. 1 second. Sorry, everyone, I'm just having a bit of an IT issue here. Sorry about that, it's had a bit of an IT issue. So this slide deck will cover a number of topics, disparities between marine and inland with relation to convention and regulation. What is TPR? Potential sources of an inland spill, potential receptors of spills, options for response, constraints associated with inland, and then a final chat about planning. So when looking at oil spill response in terms of tier preparedness and response, there are many international conventions specific to the marine environment, which was prescribed to the ratifying country what is needed in terms of preparedness through its articles and/or regulations. Guidance is then often written off the back of the convention to assist governments, operators, agency and OSROs to fulfil the obligation of the specific convention for the specific country, which enables an easier transition for national law. However, when we look at inland oil spill response in terms of tier preparedness and response, there are no such international conventions prescribing the same detail as for that of marine. So why is this? Well, beyond a country exclusive economic zone is what seas and oceans are referred to as international resources. These are resources which belong to the countries of the world, although oceans are technically viewed as international zones, meaning that not one country has jurisdiction over it. There are international regulations in place. A major oil spill to the marine environment often has a higher degree of global interest to that of an inland oil spill. This is because marine spills can and will almost probably affect many different countries and cross many international boundaries. Of course, this is dependent on the location of the spill and the environmentals at that time. So basically, oil spills to the marine environment can have a greater international impact as well as a domestic impact. But inland spills occur every day across most nations. However, as said before, there is no international convention to prescribe how to be prepared for such an event. An inland spill is usually modest, only occasionally becoming public news if it causes closure of major transport routes or if a polluter is taken to court. But an inland spill can be more persistent than a marine spill due to the nature of the affected resources and the socio-economic impact it could have. In the United Kingdom, and as for most countries of the world, inland oil spills are not regulated like that of marine oil spills. The principle is the same in the fact that the polluter must pay, but with inland spills, it is not always an easy job to find that polluter unless it happens to be from an oil gas major. Country by country have their own regime of environmental legislation for pollution prevention and control. And as an example, the responsibility of the United Kingdom environmental regulators is to protect and improve the environment. They investigate causes of pollution and aim to find the person responsible. If, as an operator, you do have a spill on site during transportation, you are responsible for its cleanup and, if necessary, restoration of that environment. If, as an operator, you do not take responsibility, the environmental regulator can arrange for the work that is needed to be done and then recharge you as your polluter. But in the UK, there is no legislation for the environment agencies to use to set standards for oil spill response, as can be for marine. Because of this lack of legislation, only good practice can be devised to ensure that if there is an incident, the polluter has and could be prepared for such an event. Today, we're going to look at an element of good practice, the TPR wheel, and the relation to inland response. The concept of tier preparedness and response is recognised internationally as the basis on which to establish a robust oil spill preparedness and response framework. The established three-tiered structure allows those involved in contingency planning to describe how an effective response to any oil spill will be provided, from small operational spillages to worst-case releases. The structure provides a mechanism to identify how individual elements of capability will be cascaded. The aim is to provide suitable response resources at the right place at the right time. Each segment of the circle represents one of 15 specific elements of capability, which when combined graphically illustrate the full response toolbox for that area of operation. The segments are all of equal size and are intended to provide a qualitative illustration only and do not represent any degree of importance or hierarchy of use. Where certain types of capability are not appropriate to the scenario, they are simply left blank. For example, in this picture, an inland spill from a pipeline will not require offshore subsea dispersant application, so this segment would remain blank, and so on and so on. Each of the 15 segments display their tier level of response. On the right-hand side, you can see that dark blue represents tier 1, green for tier 2, and grey for tier 3. Again, the illustration is a qualitative representation of the tier level capability. As a reminder, tier 1 constitutes resources necessary to handle a local spill and or provide an initial response. Tier 2 represents national or regional resources necessary to supplement the tier 1 response. And tier 3 are the global resources necessary for incidents requiring substantial additional scale, complexity, and impact. So what are some typical sources of an inland spill? Okay, so oil spills in everyday life are all around us, whether a vehicle accident, an industrial spill, or in someone's garden from a domestic oil tank. Bad housekeeping of operator sites and equipment can lead to degradation of apparatus, storage tanks can leak, and processing plants can fatigue, again through bad housekeeping. Tanker rollovers are very common, as well as the derailment of trains. Pipelines also, due to their often isolated locations, are open to theft and sabotage, and then there are potential blowouts and pump station incidents as well. So who and what could be affected by these spills? So typical receptors are rivers and their tributaries, aquifers if the lost product goes to ground, canals, reservoirs, agricultural land, transportation routes and the links associated with it, property, be it domestic or commercial property, businesses and commerce, amenities such as play parks for children, schools, shopping centres. Then there is also the more far-reaching of deserts, mountains and forests. Pretty much anything and everything we see, visit and utilise in our daily lives could potentially be affected by an inland spill. So what are some options for response? When assessing options for a response, it is important to employ the most appropriate option for the incident type, its location, the local infrastructure and the local environment. To avoid spread of contamination and escalation of pollution, it is important to contain the lost product as quickly as practically possible. Containment can be achieved by using simple equipment, not that much different to what can be used in the marine environment. And such equipment can be booms, skimmers, earth-moving machinery, drain mats, absorbents, sand, clay, stone, and so on. Lots of different aggregates. Booming is a great method to corral, limit spread, contain and deflect hydrocarbons where they may enter static or flowing water courses. The hydrocarbon will travel with the flow of the water, but there will still be interference from wind. This slide demonstrates different type of booming. We see bank to buoy at the top of the picture on the right-hand side, bank to bridge in the middle, and bank to bank at the bottom. Again, these are just illustration purposes. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of how these systems are set up. These are just for illustration purpose. As well as booming, we can do some damming. Damming will allow for more control of less wide watercourses. It allows for water height to increase behind the dam, becoming more static whilst the flow of water is exiting beneath. The static higher level of water allows for collection and recovery. This slide shows examples of sandbag damming to the left, wooden plate damming to the top, and straw bale damming to the bottom right. And it should be noted that all dams, as well as booming methods, and they need to be tended all the time to ensure integrity and purpose of being met. Interceptor trenches are also a great method to stop the spread of contamination over land, if the land type allows it. They allow for containment and recovery, limit migration, and are simple to construct either with mechanical assistance or through manpower with shovels. Quite labour intensive if you're just using manpower, but machinery, diggers and dumpers, fantastic utilisation. In this diagram here, you can see there was a rail derailment that just there and the loss of product. So there are various methods to clean up an inland oil spill. There's natural recovery. This is a very slow process, but maybe the only course of action from a safety and operational perspective. Also from an environmentally sensitivity stance, as more harm could become the area if efforts to clean it up were undertaken. There's manual recovery, again dependent on the sensitivity of the area and also looking at access and egress constraints for equipment. Manual recovery could be the only option. This method can be a very labour-intensive strategy and could utilise a large number of people and associated tools, so strong site management would be needed here to avoid further contamination to the surrounding area. We have mechanical recovery in the form of skimmers and pumps for watercourse recovery and civils equipment for land recovery. The use of civils equipment used for land recovery needs to be managed again to ensure no more waste is being unduly produced. We can use the water. If the location and conditions allow for it, controlled flooding can cause the lost oil to float to land for containment and then recovery by skimmers. And again, flushing can also remobilise oil from substrate and wash it from the surface to strategically placed containment boom for recovery later on. Absorbents are a great method to remove amounts of stranded oil. Just be mindful here of producing extra waste. And finally, we do have in situ burning, not a massively used technique, but this is a method that could be considered when physically recovering oil is not really a feasible strategy and is best utilised in very remote areas with high groundwater levels. Some environments can recover more readily from burning than if left without any form of treatment or recovery, but remember specific local permissions will be needed here. Take into account human populations, there should be a safe distance from the site, and there should also be a robust site burn plan developed and approved and communicated to all stakeholders. And the elements, the weather will also play a massive part in the decision to burn or not to burn in this instance. So when you've used some methods to contain, recover, and you've used some methods to clean up, there's going to be storage. So the cleanup activity, there is always waste management and the storage of it. Inland spill sites can be quite remote, so temporary options for storage are always needed. The best two options are that of portable storage tanks, which can be located at strategic sites with response equipment, so your tactical control points. And these are best utilised for small quantity of storage and spill cleanup. And then if we go larger scale, we can manually dig storage pits with heavy machinery. These can be lined and used to store a huge amount of waste, but bear in mind the larger the pit, the harder they are to cover. And if you're in an area that has propensity for rain, protecting those larger pits from the elements to reduce flooding and overfill can be quite a challenge. And then you'd also need the logistics to empty those storage pits and storage facilities to transport away. So looking at constraints and challenges within land, you need to ask yourself certain questions about the product and the scenarios that you will face as a risk for your operations. So will the viscosity of the product that you may lose influence your strategy? Is the product free moving when it's lost? Will it be slow flowing or will it stay static? Will the product evaporate and produce gas clouds? Will it change with different atmospheric temperatures? So basically, how will this lost product behave? We also need to take into account an influence on the strategy from the local terrain. How will this influence? Are there underground or overground utilities where you get your source pathway receptor? So it would cause that pathway to affect a receptor from the source. Are there conduits? Are there pipe runs underground, overground? Is it a freeway, a roadway, or a brown or greenfield site? Or is the spill near water? What is the geology of the site? Is it on sand, which will allow the product to permeate through it? Or are you on a thick clay mixture substrate, which will allow the product to free phase and migrate laterally? So is the site easily accessible in terms of logistics, and can people and equipment get in and out easily? Talking further with the terrain, are there steep slopes which will aid with the lateral migration of a lost product? Because the fluid will always want to flow downhill. Is the ground impermeable? A surface where oil may come across no boundary, it will flow with lateral migration. If so, try to contain it, block drains, block inlets. Is the ground permeable? A surface where oil may seep and be absorbed with little runoff. Here you need to limit the flow of vertical migration by spreading the oil and possibly introducing water to a bund base to make the free phase oil rise so it's easier to contain and skim off, as well as blocking drains and inlets. If oil enters groundwater, it can stay there for years and it can often be impossible to remove. So just bear that in mind with permeable substrate. So when responding to inland spills, the main factors to consider are stakeholders, logistics, and the geography of the spill site. Equipment selection and the tactics employed may change very little in relation to the volume of oil to be recovered. Overcoming waste management issues in remote locations is a considerable challenge. Often in remote locations, the quality of the road infrastructure can be so inadequate that transporting oiled waste long distances can be very difficult or impossible to achieve. A robust Tier 1 capability can assist responders in the initial stages of a response and ensure time and resources are used to the greatest effect. Seasonal variation has an enormous effect on response techniques. The feasibility of the response technique used in an inland response strategy will change throughout the year. Watercourses that may be dry or flowing at very low levels in the dry season can turn into wide, fast-flowing channels at other times of the year. Information on the pathways for pollution into watercourses is essential. Refineries and storage tank facilities benefit from understanding the drainage routes for mobile oil away from the source. Oil will travel overland or through drainage systems away from the source. Tactical response plans should provide information on pathways for pollution so that if containment is breached, secondary response sites are identified. Oil that has penetrated sediments can seep out over prolonged periods of time, requiring long-term monitoring strategies to be implemented post-spill termination. To achieve a greater understanding of the environmental impacts of inland spills and for possible remobilisation of resources, an effective post-spill monitoring strategy should be in place. If you have a coherent and well-understood oil spill contingency plan, you will know your risk, understand your mitigations to reduce those risks, know where the most environmental and socio-economic sensitive areas are located with relation to the posed risk, know the best response options available to combat any loss, and where the response control points are in relation to the identified risk, and understand who are the internal and external stakeholders to communicate and work alongside during an event. All the aforementioned can be consolidated by teams through testing and maintaining the plan and validating through regular exercise. So thanks for listening. That's brought me to the conclusion of my, how long have we been? 23-minute seminar. On the screen there, I've got the 3 pertinent good practice guides from IPECA that I've used to reference this presentation. So we've got the link there for the Tier Preparedness and Response Good Practice Guide, oil spills and inland response, good practice guide, and contingency planning. It says for oil spills on water, but contingency planning, the contingency planning document can also be utilised for inland spills. I've also got my email address there and my LinkedIn details. So if you want to reach out, ask any questions, come for any information, just feel free to reach out and I'm here to answer any questions. I'm sure there will be some questions I can't see presently, but I'm sure Emma will direct me to them. So thanks very much for listening.
There aren't any questions in the chat currently, but if anybody would like to ask Richard a question, please do put it in the chat. We'll wait for a few minutes to see if there are any questions. Oh, one question's just come in. Richard, what would you say is the key difference between inland and offshore response?
Good question. Key difference between inland and offshore response. I think with offshore response, you're dealing with a product that's lost on one surface, and that is the surface of the ocean. And depending, if you're offshore, there is a possibility of it landing shore, but you're just dealing with one element, and that's the water, and taking it off there, obviously with possible adverse weather and sea conditions. Whereas in the inland environment, there is a myriad of possibilities for where that lost product can go, depending on where the incident has actually happened. It depends on the substrate of the ground where the spill has happened. There could be a watercourse nearby where underground drainage could allow your product to follow as a pathway to pollute that waterway. It could be in a domestic built-up area. I know a lot of worldwide oil pipelines pass through very built-up areas. So the propensity and the potential to affect a wider reaching environment and population of receptors, I would say, is the big difference there. I hope that helps.
Okay, we've got another question here. What are the similarities of nearshore marine response and inland response?
Similarities are quite strong actually, because nearshore response can deal with oil that is potentially going to go into estuaries, river mouths, and could affect local amenities and businesses, etc. So there's quite a parallel between nearshore shoreline response and inland response in terms of equipment as well, for the size of booms you'd use, types of skimmers you'd use, obviously oil type dependent, but there's quite a similarity there. There'd be different potentially different booming techniques. Obviously, alongside a nearshore and a shoreline scenario, you will have drift of current along the shoreline, and in a river, you will have current as well. I would say current in a river can possibly be a lot stronger than that on a nearshore or shoreline current against a beach, but you'd use the same principles of very acute angled booming to try and contain, corral, and recover. So there is a bit of difference, but the similarity would be quite the same. I hope that helps.
Another one's just come in. When evaluating the danger of an oil spill, would you say it's more important? What would you say is more important, the actual type of oil or the environment/landscape?
Good question. Well, that's a hard one to answer, because the environment has a huge importance, and obviously to do your operation, you'd have had to go through a lot of hoops from environmental regulators to be able to do the operation that you want to do in that area, associated to the risk that you would pose to being there. Then again, you've got to look at the human element with the type of oil you would be using as well. It's a very good question. I think that's a question I'd need to take away, digest, have a little bit of a think about it, and get back to you with that one, if that's okay. If you could leave your details in the chat, I'll give you a more coherent answer rather than try and cobble something together on the hoof, if that's okay.
Oh, another one's just come in. What is the locational distance of a petroleum facility from the shoreline for it to be considered near shore?
Very good question again. I would suggest anything that is on land is inland. As far as a distance, a designated distance to proclaim it as being near shore, again, I would not know a definitive answer to that. I'm not sure there is a definitive answer to that, but that is something, again, I can go away, I'll research that for you, and I'll get back to you with a better coherent answer if that's okay, and you leave the details for me.
We also had a question about the slides and whether they can be available for people who didn't join the webinar in time. Yes, absolutely. And we will also send out the recording so that you can view the webinar from the start. There was an FYI comment from Mark Brown about the Environment and Climate Change Canada has recently produced a new inland field guide. That's good to know. I don't know if you're aware of that, Richard.
No, I'd love to have a link to that, please, if anyone could put that in the chat.
For shoreline scat, what are the techniques for inland spill?
Again, that would be a completely different seminar. I think we did a SCAT seminar on the TPR series. If not, there will be one coming up, I'm sure, if there's not one already recorded from this series.
I think that's the next one, Richard, actually, on the 20th of September.
It would follow the same principles as shoreline SCAT.
I think we may be at the end of the questions now. I can't see any new ones that coming in.
Okay, thanks very much, Emma. Thanks everyone for listening. And again, if I haven't fulfilled your need for the answer to the question, and if I've asked you to throw your details into the chat, please do so, and I will endeavour to get the best answer I can to you in due course, if that's okay. But thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks everybody for joining.